Welcome to the Art and Alchemy Lab, a podcast that explores transformation through creativity. I am your host, Allison Adams. I will be speaking with modern alchemists, artists, healers, and visionaries who have learned to transmute lead into personal growth and spiritual gold. Hello, everyone. Today's guest is Cyril Coetzee, a world-renowned lecturer in art history and esoteric science, and a portrait artist whose work spans continents and collections. He's also regarded as the favorite portrait artist of Nelson Mandela, which we will talk about in this episode. I discovered Cyril and his ability to teach about mystical creativity through a series of courses through the Center for Applied Jungian Studies. This is where his insights into the alchemical symbolism of birds first sparked my curiosity and led me down the rabbit hole that became my Oracle deck project as well as this podcast. In this visually oriented episode, we'll unpack how Cyril uses symbols to convey deeper states of consciousness and how visionary art can illuminate our understanding of creativity and self-realization. If you're listening, check the show notes for links to the artworks we discuss or watch the video version on YouTube or Substack to see Cyril's references up close. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow the links to his website and like, follow, subscribe, etc. to my page here. I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I. Let's welcome Cyril to the show. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you, Cyril.
I'll just say hello, then it keeps it neutral.
Well, you're in South Africa, and I'm in California. It's morning for me, and it's 7 o'clock in the evening. A little time travel.
I'll say hello to everyone present.
Yeah, and thank you so much for being a guest. I want to say that since I started this podcast, I've really hoped that you would be a guest of mine one day.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you.
Well, I think you're the one that really inspired me to start looking into alchemy when I took one of your classes through the Applied Jung Center, and we did the art and individuation classes during the pandemic.
Applied Jungian Studies.
That's it. That's right. It was online, people all over the world. The course was called Art and Individuation, and you came in and talked about alchemy, and you talked about the birds of alchemy. And something about the symbology of that just cracked something open inside of me. And then over the next few years, I began to study the symbols. And you can see right behind me one of my first paintings.
It's wonderful to see them display like that. Yeah.
I just wanted to say thank you. It's because of you and your inspiring teaching as an artist that really unlocked something that I'm very passionate about now.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's good. Are you going to make your paintings into, they look as though they'd work well as a set of cards.
Yeah, that's what I want to do. Yeah, they will be. I have yet to publish them, but I'm definitely interacting with them.
No, I'm sure they'll have their market, I'm sure.
I just don't know if I'm going to have somebody else do it or if I'm doing it myself. And that's kind of where I'm playing with that field right now. Because if nobody wants to publish them for me, then I'm going to have to do it myself. And this is something, as an artist, you're teaching and you're making art. You've been a professional artist for a long time. And yet all of these things that we learn about with alchemy and symbols are kind of always happening in the background. And I see that in your work.
Indeed. Yeah, that's right. I mean, I must say that two things going on in my work that maybe I should just mention. One is that when I first started painting, I came to symbols intuitively through the process, without necessarily always having a background of understanding of the traditions behind those symbols. But just because they spoke to me or they resonated intuitively, I incorporated them into my work. And then only later on did I start to use the symbols, I think, with more depth of understanding. But it's quite interesting how these archetypes come up, even if you don't know anything about them. They speak so powerfully to one. And I think a lot of artists work that way. You know, they just see a symbol and it speaks to them and they want to use it somehow. They're not even sure, but somehow it opens up an understanding when you start working with it. I'm sure you find that as well. When you start working with it, it unlocks an understanding simply because the image itself resonates in your, I'm going to say soul, in the depths of your soul. And it unlocks a secret, if you like, something to do with creation or to do with the mystery of life, and it unlocks a secret when you work with it.
It's like a code.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
You always
It
have
was,
that connection to
yeah,
symbols?
I think I've always had that as an innate inclination. I remember even when I was a very young child, I'm talking about 7 or 8 years old, I had this very strong inclination to paint or to draw faces. I'm going to say portraits, but portraits is even too pretentious. I just obsessively was drawing faces.
Mm.
And some of them looked like old icons, these Byzantine icons. They look like saints or holy figures. And I did that from an early age. And I remember it caused some confusion when I was a young child at school because we'd be given a subject to paint by the art teacher. And I wouldn't be interested in what she wanted us to paint. And I would start painting these faces. And then she would try to find a way of making what I was doing relevant to the project that she was set. But you know how it is at school. Like, I
Well, the
remember
mark of
that's
a
what,
true artist is not following directions.
I mean, one learns to be a good child later on. But at that early stage, I just had this compulsion
Yeah.
to draw these sort of mystical heads, mystical faces. And a lot of my art starts with faces. I am a portrait painter as
Yeah.
well. So I've always wanted to paint, if not people around me, but imaginary people, people who I feel have some kind of
Mm.
archetypal reality behind them. That's how I started. And quite often, every painting would start as a kind of imaginary portrait, and then somehow symbols would start entering into the portrait. And I'd create a space around the figure, which would, in a way, enhance an understanding of who that being is.
I took another course with you. It's coming back to me. It was
Yes,
the other
please.
side course, the women mystics. And you
Yeah,
brought in, I have this book.
I spoke about Odilo Redon,
That's right.
and I talked about female photographers as well, but I don't
Yes.
think,
It was the Rodin one that I'm relating
yeah,
to now. It sounds like you were channeling some of the same ideas
yeah,
when you were a child. I'm really
absolutely.
fascinated also with that. You clearly were able to pick up on something that other was
Well,
there or not.
yeah, I mean, I don't know how much of a believer you are. I'm going to say believer. It's maybe the wrong word, but how much of a knower might be a
Mm,
better word. But to what extent you take these archetypes as spiritual realities, or whether you prefer more abstract understanding that these are somehow archetypes, but exactly where or what they are, you're not going to enter into. I know some people have a closed door when it comes to the word spiritual. And they prefer to say these are images in the unconscious, or whatever the case may be. They prefer that
yeah.
language, the psychologistic language.
Manifested
Yeah.
some that
Yeah.
now I had in my life and now I have.
Alison, you probably might resonate with this. What I've always been interested in is the idea of visionary art. Artists, I mean, Odilo Redon is obviously one of those, but there are many others, even going back to the medieval time. I would say, like Blake, for instance, in the 18th century, but there are lots of female ones as well, visionary artists who come up with images that clearly are
Mm,
images drawn from another dimension of reality altogether. That really interests me, the idea of higher states of consciousness and imagination of higher worlds.
mhm.
That's really what a lot of it's about for me, the idea of receiving impressions of other dimensions. A lot of people would think we're crazy talking like that, but I think the history of art is full of artists like that who are visionary artists.
I like that title as
Yeah, so
something to
that's really, yeah.
aspire to.
Yeah, that these alchemical symbols that we like so much, particularly these bird images,
Mhm.
they also these bird images point to higher stages of consciousness. I think they're winged creatures because winged creatures are always a picture of a flight into another dimension or something like that.
Before we talk a little bit more about the alchemical birds, which I definitely want to get into, I want to
Yeah,
just
yeah.
quickly share your website. Wonderful paintings of Nelson Mandela. Are they huge?
That one is life size, and I painted it when he was president of South Africa. And of course, it was such an iconic painting because it was a moment in our history of a transition to a real democracy. We talked about the Rainbow Nation at that time because Nelson Mandela was an iconic figure of liberation. And I was very fortunate because I painted a portrait of George Bezos, who was a lifelong friend of Nelson Mandela, as you may know. He was the lawyer who defended Mandela at the Rivonia trials just before he was put in prison. So I was very fortunate to meet Mandela through George Bezos. And that's how I got commissioned to paint Nelson Mandela. Yes.
He's so
Well,
handsome. My goodness.
that's probably about the sum of it. You can see there those two big ones, one where he has his leg crossed over the knee. The other one, which is more famous, is famous because it became an international stamp.
Damn,
So you
that's
can see
cool.
what I was talking about earlier, this compulsion to paint icons, if you know what I mean. I had that inherent thing from a young child to paint icons. And in a way, meeting Mandela and painting him was really like the fulfillment on a certain level of my childhood inclination to paint icons. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think it is the one painting that Mandela saw as the one that truly represented, certainly that one that was on the stamp.
They're, I mean, they're all just have such a tenderness in
Yeah,
them and a light.
yes. So the marriage portrait and this one that you've got on center screen now, I was commissioned to paint for Mandela.
Wonderful.
The other ones, the smaller ones with paisley shirts, are based on material from having met him. You know, I'd
Yeah.
sketched and taken
Yeah, they weren't.
photographs, and I painted them of my own inclination, really. Yeah, so I have done these so-called narrative paintings because there are quite a few of those narrative magic realist paintings,
No.
which a lot of them do have alchemical associations to them. So you can see, for
Really?
instance, in this middle one on screen here, there's symbolism in the background. Is what I'm talking about, where, you know, yes, it's a portrait of a couple, but somehow there are spiritual symbols behind them. In this case, symbols from the Hindu tradition. So you can see Krishna there, and you can see various flowers and also a kind of vehicle figure, the sun and the moon. So there's a feeling of an alchemical conjunction brought into the idea of marriage, you know, this union of sun and moon, which is traditional in alchemy very much. There are lots of these conjunctions of sun and moon, which indicate different levels of alchemy as it goes through the different stages. You know, they talk about a first conjunction and a second conjunction and so on. And so that just was read into the marriage image. I painted that for a couple who'd recently got married, and they liked the idea of having these sort of spiritual symbolic connotations brought in. So,
Mm,
and if
wonderful.
you highlight the one adjacent to that of the couple in an interior, that was one of my earliest mature paintings. I
Mm.
did it as a student when I was studying at art school, and it was done entirely from imagination. There were no sitters for it. So it's done in what I'd call a naive realist style. The figures were drawn entirely from imagination. The only naturalistic element is a self-portrait. That's me standing as a young man in the doorway, looking in on this couple. And of course, this is a device that you see in a lot of Renaissance paintings, which I think I'm
Dog.
borrowing for this exercise. And the dog on the floor was one of our family dogs. But the rest of the painting is completely imaginary. And as I said, I love inventing faces. And somehow when one invents them, you then recognize them and you don't know why, you know.
Mm.
I
This
mean,
just reminds me of like some of the early surrealists.
yeah,
I love that
yeah,
allegorical kind of work.
yeah. I like costume. You know, I enjoy painting people in costume. Like I've done quite a few of carnival figures and circus figures, and it's really interesting for me how much alchemy there is in circus imagery. You
Mm.
know, even if you think of the things that people do in a circus, walking on tight ropes or eating fire and all those
Mhm.
things, that a lot of them have initiatic
That's
connotations to
true.
them that relate to alchemy. Yeah.
You know, my one of my earliest memories of having both like fear and delight at the same time,
Mm.
which was a little overwhelming, I think, was at a circus in Guatemala City with my dad when I was very young.
Oh,
And
yeah,
I
right.
remember there was a girl, she was a trapeze artist, which I
Mm.
was just like in love with. I remember
Yeah, yeah.
she was pink. I could not believe how beautiful she was. Never seen anything like it. And then there were also two clowns that were fighting in Spanish that just terrified me.
Yeah. Clowns
And
are frightening.
and it's
Clowns can be
interesting
frightening.
because the idea of masks, when I go
Yeah,
back
that's,
into, like, my work as or my personal work trying to narrate it in a painting, I often use, like, tribal masks, but also I often see this character who is dressed in a pink leotard. She'll be kind of in different ages. Sometimes it'll be
yes.
me, sometimes it's someone
And I
else, and
completely relate to that.
So yeah, there is an alchemy that continues because the imagination just grabs you.
Yeah.
It's so visceral as a child to
Mm.
see all those animals and strange people dressed up as things. I've never really thought of it
So
as
that's
an
always been
alchemical
yeah, so we share
initiation.
that. Yeah, yeah.
Wow. Well, okay. So this is at your website here, and I'll put a link for this so people can play with that a little.
Yeah, there are quite a few circusy ones there too. If people are interested in that, they can look for
Yeah.
them. Yeah.
Well, you also sent another picture of an alchemical bird. So I'll just pull this one up and then I'm going to ask you, can you see that one?
Yes, in fact, we should come to that one second. There's another one because that's a later stage in the process, but there's another
Let's
one which
see.
shows the raven and the swan. It would be two that I sent you.
Okay. Is it this one?
Correct, that's right. It's not necessarily beautiful as alchemical plates go, but what I like about it is it's got such a clear narrative of the stages. The first few stages of alchemy are there in a very clear narrative.
Mm,
Because, people often say, well, which comes first? If you look at alchemy as a stage of evolution or stages of self-development on a path of initiation, that first bird right in the front of the picture is, of course, your crow or your raven, which is that nigredo phase of alchemy, the first stage of alchemy. So you know already if this bird is in the foreground, that you're going to be reading from the front into the back, into the distance as the sequence progresses. So the nigredo, of course, is that stage we go through, which is like a mystical death process.
mhm,
I see you've done your own versions of that nigredo. I think there's
yes.
one right behind you there in a flask of a black bird. So that's the raven or the crow. And that indicates also the death of ordinary thinking. Ordinary intellectual thinking has to go through a kind of death to get to a higher form of imaginative thinking, which is a spiritual way of thinking, which the alchemists associate with imagination. So from ordinary intellectual thought, you rise to imaginative thought. And that's the picture of the person lying on peacock feathers, because the peacock is the second stage, which has to do with vision into the astral world. But what it also indicates, because a peacock's tail has lots of eyes on it, what seem to be lots of eyes, that you're seeing with many eyes. The symbol is you're seeing with many eyes a world of mobile pictures and imaginations. That's the first real higher step. So from raven, we go to peacock. And then we go after peacock to swan. You can see in the background there are these swans going past. And that's a real shift from peacock to swan, because the swan is then inspirational consciousness. It's higher than imaginative consciousness. Inspirational consciousness is where you open up somehow like a cup to receive something unexpected. In the creative process, you can put down hundreds of pictures and live in these imaginative pictures. But there's also a point where you say no and you quiet all those pictures and you open yourself inwardly to receive something that you're not expecting in the process. And that's, of course, the stage of the swan. You can see how the image of the swan suits that. This whiteness. This is now the albedo stage, called the white stage of alchemy. Now, I must just point out that when we talk about stages of alchemy, there are different accounts. For instance, Jung talks about black, and he doesn't talk about the green peacock stage. He talks about black, then white, then yellow, then red. But if you read other writers, they talk about black and green and white and red, and they leave out the yellow. But if you wanted to look at it comprehensively, you'd say black, then green, then white, then yellow, then red. So 5 stages. Not to make it too complicated, but here we go in this painting you've got on screen now. Black to green or blue-green for the peacock. It's not very blue in this image. It's already going towards the yellow. But then you've got the white stage, and then if you flick to the other image, which has got other birds on it, you can see some of the further stages of higher consciousness as symbolized by alchemists. Now, again, we started, in this case, we're not going backwards in space, we're going from the bottom up. And you can see here this conjunction of sun and moon I was talking about earlier with alchemical marriage. Here you can see, and don't think of the modern birds or the proper ornithological birds. Like, you wouldn't think that that black bird there, on the left bottom, you wouldn't associate that with what we understand to be a pelican. But that's in fact what this alchemist had obviously never seen a real pelican. And this is an imagination of a pelican. Plucking, of course, plucking its breast for the red blood that it will then feed to its young. So that's what the pelican stage of alchemy has to do with. It's got to do with a stage of self-sacrifice, which is associated with the rubido, the red stage. So normally in that pelican image, you'll find red blood and you'll find little chicks being fed on red blood. And obviously pelicans don't really feed their chicks on blood. But in the symbol of the mystical symbol of the pelican, there's an image of sacrifice of self, which is quite a high step, because when you go from inspiration, the swan, to the next higher stage of consciousness, you're going to the level of the pelican, which is the shift from white to red. And you first go through a yellowing process called citrinitas, which has to do with yellowing. So from white, you go to yellowing, and then you go to red. And already with the pelican, there's a hint of red, but you can see the other bird adjacent to that is a phoenix, which is a red bird in flames. And of course, we know that as a bird who dies and resurrects out of flames, dies and resurrects. So it's a still higher stage of consciousness, which I associate, and I'm going to be corrected by anyone who knows better, but it means you're crossing from the soul world to the spirit world. There's a difference between soul and spirit. And the spirit world is now pictured here, but it's the lower level of the spirit world, the so-called, in Hindu terminology, lower divashan. But then you go at the top to this double-headed eagle with a black and a red wing, which you might think brings together the two birds at the bottom into a still higher stage, which is the ultimate stage, this double-headed eagle, which means that you're twice born. You come to to your true spirit being, your spirit human being, which is the upper divashan, the higher spirit world. So if you take these 6 birds that we've looked at, the black one, the raven, and then you go to the peacock, and then you go to the swan, and then you go to the pelican, and then to the phoenix, and then to the double-headed eagle, you can see a transformation of birds, which pictures stages in spiritual perception of higher worlds. So from the physical world, which is the dead raven, you go to the imaginative world, the etheric world, which is to do with the peacock, and then you go to the astral world, the swan, and then you come to the lower divashanic world, the higher divashanic world, and even transcending that. So there's this, whether you go into Kabbala or alchemy or mystical philosophies of yoga, you're going to ultimately find equivalent symbols in various cultural traditions. But I think what's interesting in the Western alchemical tradition is that alchemists actually did experiments in retorts with substances. They did experiments in retorts. A lot of your paintings, Alison, have got these flasks of the alchemists. You can see that behind you there, those flasks of the alchemists. Oh, they mixed things in retorts and flasks, and they used fire, and they distilled things, and they evaporated things, and they burned things, and they did various processes. But the idea of alchemy is that in making those external experiments, the alchemists were metaphorically exploring parallel inner processes in the soul and in the spirit. And it had to do with the transformation of the lower, the base element, the physical body or physical material, carbon, coal, transform that into the diamond body or into gold. So this idea of the nobler metals or the nobler aspects of material being pictures of the levels of higher consciousness that I've been talking about.
Yes.
I know that's a lot to swallow, but it's just a
summation.
No,
it's wonderful. I love hearing it.
Yeah.
And I think that's the thing with this. I mean, our listeners will pick up on the parts, hopefully, that inspire them. Also, just finding ways to make sense of this complicated stuff. It ends up being less complicated when you break it down into the symbols. And what I've enjoyed with this series is that it doesn't always go from black to white or black to yellow to white or whatever. You can mix it up because that's the reality of experiment. Sometimes you have to go back a few steps before you go forward. So I like how you showed how sometimes the birds are shown differently, and also whatever's in the foreground is sort of where you start, and then you go back into the story.
Yeah. The different alchemists often contradict each other in the way they use symbols, but there is a core of commonality. I mean, Jung is interesting to read on these stages of alchemy too, because he talks about them from a psychological point of view. You know how, for instance, when you become depressed and you go into a crisis, you go into a kind of into a negrido phase in your psyche. And then as you go into therapy, if it's Jungian therapy, as Jung had in mind, psychoanalysis, you'd go through stages where these other birds would come in. You start to have inklings of significance and meaning in your experiences that allow you eventually to
Yeah.
take the next step. And it's possible to find, and Jung did that.
Yeah.
He found at least 4 steps. In his case, the black, the white, the yellow, and the red. And he talked about how this individuation process takes you from the initial black towards the red, which is the highest stage he talks about.
Yes.
So you can always look up Jung on alchemy and therapy because he
Yeah.
talks about therapy. Yeah.
I became a big fan of Hillman's work with
Yes.
alchemy, who was taught by Jung. He was like the next generation, bit of a bad boy
Yeah.
in the psychology world because he spent a lot of his career trying to dismantle everything he had been
Well, that
taught.
must have helped you with your own work quite a
He
bit.
did. He helped me a lot because he had such a sense of humor about things. And there's
Mm,
this really great talk. It was a talk that I was able to listen to. It was like a
mm,
3-day event he did in the 90s, I think, in
mm.
Dallas. So I kind of came in with a little bit of understanding, basically, with the birds that you had introduced me to. And
Yeah.
then I realized he taught about these too. So I started
Mm,
checking in.
yeah.
But what I really got from what he taught me, and then started the
Mm,
project in full, was he talked about how the alchemist work really changed when they brought glass vials in to the lab, because before that they had been in these retorts, but maybe you couldn't see through them. They were just,
yeah.
I don't know, whatever they used at the time, metal bowls. Once they were able to see what was going on at different times inside of the retort and
Mm,
inside of the vessel, they could kind of step back and take notes and
yeah.
see different things happening. And he talked about how that is our work with ourselves as we realize that everything in our
Yes.
life is a
That,
changing experiment and we can't always handle everything at the same time, but we can get ourselves out of the hot water and
right.
into the viewer, the witness mode. And so
Yeah.
that really inspired me to draw all
Mm,
of these inside of little
yeah.
bottles to see through, because once you can recognize that there's a stage happening and you recognize stages are meant to be temporary, that you are trying to get to
Mm,
the next level with it, it puts fire under my purpose. It makes me
yeah.
feel like I can relax into change because some things are on fire and I need to get to them right away. Other things I can let bubble. And he also talked about using the language of alchemy as another way to sort of embody that spiritual shift. So if you say, I'm burning with anger, or I'm
Exactly. Yeah.
sweating bullets, or whatever you say, it
Yeah.
kind of brings you into the body and then the body becomes
Yeah.
the vessel.
Or you say somebody leaves you cold, or,
Exactly.
all these different things.
I feel dried
Yeah.
out,
That's
not
right.
passionate. It's like,
But
well,
these
what
are
do you
so
add?
archetypal. And then, of course, you've got the idea of the 4 humors,
Mm,
the 4 temperaments, which traditionally they spoke. And I mean, the alchemists spoke about this, Aristotle spoke about it,
yes,
where you've got the cholerics, the sanguine, the phlegmatic, and the melancholic.
melancholics.
And they,
Yeah,
of course, relate to fire, air, water, and earth.
yeah,
So you can think of a personality who's a true choleric, someone who's fiery and tells everyone what to do, sort of a Napoleon figure. He tells other people what to do. And of course, you get archetypal women like that too. They talk about these Karen, they call them Karen people.
carrying the cholerics.
Yeah, yeah, they are, because they're bossy, got a lot of fire. That means the ego element, the fire in us is dominant.
Mhm,
Then you've got the sanguine people, and it's not using the word sanguine in the way we commonly use it in English, but sanguine people are like butterflies. They've got this air element very strong, and they'll tend to flit from one topic to another. And you can't ever pin them down because they seem to be changing the subject all the time. Or little children that run around, and one minute they're crying, and the next minute they're laughing. But you can see the astrality in that. That air element is very strong with sanguine
yeah,
children.
yeah,
And then you've got the phlegmatics who seem to be lazy, but they're not really. They just love to sit and watch other people do things. You get that child on the playground who watches what the other children are doing. But if one of them hurts herself or himself, that will be the child who comes to the rescue, who has this quality of empathy. And so there's a strength in water there, you see, the
mhm,
water element. They might have a lot of water in their bodies, which makes them very empathetic and sensitive. Yeah,
mm.
they're phlegmatic. Then the
Pretty,
melancholics are burdened by their physical bodies.
mm,
They've got too much of the black bile, according to the alchemists.
mm,
They're burdened by the physical body, and they get
it's
depressed. They're depressed, but they're also very deep.
right.
The archetype being Hamlet, in his black costume. archetypal melancholic figure in literature. Anyway, enough of that, but
No, it's
you can
great.
see.
I've heard those described. I remember learning about the Middle Ages in middle school in
Mm.
7th grade. It's actually where I live now. It's not very far from that room. I'm very aware of where that is. I
Oh,
had this wonderful teacher. We were learning about world history and we learned about the Middle Ages, and I was horrified by them, but my imagination was lit up by them
yeah,
also.
yeah,
I remember
yeah,
learning about those humors even then and being like, that's so interesting. Because, I love astrology. I love personality tests. I love
yeah,
Myers
yeah.
Briggs stuff. But I like it because of what you're saying. You can kind of see people's strengths and I don't even want to say weaknesses, but like just
Yeah,
parts
the
of their personalities
one-sidedness
that
of
may
the,
lean a certain way. And then you can make better connections if you
yeah,
understand this sort of energy of people.
we can learn to balance out our
Yeah.
one-sidedness as well.
But I remember this thing hit me back then, and I'll just tell you the story. But that was like the first time in my life that I had a spontaneous, I felt like a past life flashback. And I
Yeah,
didn't know what that was at the time. Again, it could just have been part of my imagination. I'm a knower, not a believer, right?
right, yeah, yeah.
So I had this thought of, I think it was the first time I learned that girls weren't educated, and probably not
Mhm.
anybody that was poor either. But I saw that there was all these rapes and pillages happening all over, and these wild ways of like bleeding people with leeches really captured my imagination. But I had this thought of, I would hope that if I lived then that my dad would have had the wherewithal to put me into a convent so I could be
Mhm.
safer, but mostly
Yeah,
so that I could be educated. And I imagined myself being a young nun that
yeah,
would
yeah.
be like illuminated
Yes,
artist, like write, lettering, copying the
yes,
Bible or
yes,
whatever. That came back to me while I was making these cards because you can kind of see, this is a big one, but you can kind of see I was using
yes,
like
yes.
Latin lettering. And I ended up
Mm.
marrying a man who he's passed now, but he was a font designer. So I got to visit all of these, like the Book of Kells was in
Right,
a
right.
museum and stuff with
Yes,
him.
yes,
And so it's interesting just to go back to you're reminding me how this conversation is started a long time ago for me,
yeah,
but
yeah.
it's only now coming into a place where I can speak about it with a sense of
I can
ownership.
certainly see you in the Middle Ages. I think I relate to that completely. I mean, yeah, the options for women, it was probably the best thing to get educated going into the church at that time.
Mhm,
Yeah.
mhm.
The classic is Hildegard von Bingen,
Yes,
those wonderful paintings that she did in her
yes.
writings. And yeah, and there was Teresa of Avila, who was friendly with John of the Cross in Spain in the
Yeah.
17th century. It's interesting mystical women in the
Yeah.
Middle.
Let's go to the artwork that I asked you to share.
Yeah, that's great. Ultimately, one needs to zoom in a bit, but we've got some details. But let me talk about it a little bit. Because, I mean, when you say share a painting that was transformative for you, there are literally hundreds of such paintings because depending which aspect of one's path as an artist you're talking about, one was transformed by varieties of different paintings. But from the point of view of my interest in symbolism and initiation and alchemy, and that this is a very important picture for me. I mean, look, it's fine. It gives you the overall conception. People might need to look it up and go in. There are details on the internet, if you know where to find them, of various aspects of this painting. But of course, it's an altarpiece in a place called Teinach, which is near Württemberg in Bavaria. And it's full of alchemy and Kabbala. Kabbala being Jewish mysticism. But of course, this is Christianized Kabbala. There was a bunch of women living in Württemberg in the 17th century. I think it was during the 60 Years' War or the 30 Years' War. I don't know which, but there were two terrible wars between the Catholics and the Protestants. And I think maybe this was the 30 Years' War. A lot of women were without men because the men were all killed in these wars that went on for, as I say, 30 or even 60 years in one case. And this painting was done by a woman called Princess Antonia. She didn't paint it, but she inspired the artist who did paint it.
Mm,
Her name was Princess Antonia of Bavaria, and she was part of a circle of women who studied Christian Kabbalism in Germany in that period, in the Baroque period. And if you look at the other panels, this is simply one of the panels. There are other panels that fold out like an altarpiece, where you can see one panel with lots of women
Wow.
all going up to heaven. If you Google it, you'll find the other panels as well. We couldn't talk about them all. But obviously, this is a mystical temple painting. It's a painting of a mystical temple. And of course, yes, it's a temple, but it's also the inner temple, the temple within ourselves. And what you're seeing here is Princess Antonia of Württemberg at the bottom of the painting. And we see her from the back in a green dress. And if you go to the detail, you can see she's setting out on a path towards this inner temple. So we're talking here about an initiatic journey that Princess Württemberg was going on. And of course, she really was going on an initiatic journey because she was studying Kabbala. And of course, what you learn in Kabbala is it's the same as in alchemy, is that you're starting, as it were, on the material plane with material realities. And if you go to the Kabbalistic tree, the base of the Kabbalistic tree, the whole Kabbalistic tree is built into this painting. And sometime you should look at diagrams of Kabbalistic tree because it shows you the four worlds that I spoke about with regard to the birds. So there's this lower world of the physical, and then there's, which is called Azia in the Hebrew word for the Azia, the plane of the physical world and the physical actions. And so she starts out here at the bottom of the painting in that world of physical senses and physical actions.
And she's
And she
holding a
stands there.
burning heart.
Yeah, she's holding a burning heart. She's carrying an upside down anchor, like a ship's anchor. But on the anchor, there's a cross, you can see. It's anchor simultaneously a cross. And if you were to invert that, you would have the anchor as a kind of moon with a cross standing on it. So the anchor in one way is a symbol always of faith, but faith understood that you commit your will to something. It's not blind faith in the sense of believing just because somebody tells you, but it's the idea of putting your will to something and acting in good faith, So she's got this anchor, which is a symbol of committing her will. And of course, the flaming heart is her devotional enthusiasm for what she's undertaking. And then there's a little sheep, a mystical lamb that accompanies her on this journey. So the mystical lamb sort of indicates, spiritual purity, I suppose. And so you've got spiritual purity, you've got love, and you've got faith. She takes these three attributes, which are really the three attributes of the soul, if you like, that are required in order to walk this path. And you can see above her head, there's a lion going in a path. I must just say she's entering an enclosed garden. And this idea in the Middle Ages of the hortus conclusus, or the enclosed garden, is very important symbol. You see there are roses on the fence and there are grapes on the fence, I think. So there again, you have symbols of the passion. The rose is a symbol of the passion, and then, of course, the grape is a symbol of the blood of Christ in this case, because it's Christian alchemy, you know what I mean, in this case, or Christian Kabbala. But if you go back to the big picture, we'll put her in a context where you can see she's entering into the garden, and the garden is made up of 12 regions. 12 flower beds, if you like, with different plants in them. I'm not going to go into the detail of all these plants, but this is such an intricate symbolic structure, this painting, because every detail in it is hugely significant with layers of spiritual symbolism. And so there you can see at the bottom, she's entering this garden, and there's a circle of 12 significant figures relating, of course, to the zodiac, the 12 signs of the zodiac, which, of course, spiritually, these are the regions of heaven. And so she's entering into a knowledge of things from a higher point of view. You're not just trapped now in a physical view of things, but you're starting to look at the world from multiple points of view, and you're starting to take into account that the world is underpinned by cosmic order, by the cosmic order of the zodiac. And the 12 figures standing there, I think in the symbolism of this painting, they're probably the 12 tribes of Israel, symbolized by various figures, Jude or
Disciples, could
Dan
they
or
be the 12 disciples in some?
Yes, exactly. In another sense, the 12 disciples. And then you've got a fountain in the middle of the garden, as you so often do in Renaissance gardens, find a fountain with a figure in it. And it might be the figure of the wisdom goddess, but in this case, it's a figure of Jesus Christ, but he's standing in a fountain. And of course, I think if you were able to see him closely, you would find that there's a stream coming out of his body, like a stream of ethereal blood coming out of his body into the water. So this is the idea of the tree of life, or the fertilization of the garden from a spiritual source. But that, of course, that symbolizes the foundation, the primordial fountain, the foundation of reality, which is called Yesod in the Kabbala. But there you're entering the imaginative world as well, which is related to the peacock. And if you look, we also can see a faint, I don't know if you can see the rainbow faintly through the picture.
Mm-hmm.
If you look from one side to the other, it cuts through the two columns. You can see a white line,
Mm-hmm.
like a double white line that curves across. That rainbow shows the threshold that you cross when you go from Yetzirah, the etheric world, to the astral world, Bariah. Anyway, I won't go into all that, but the point is that you're going up a level. And there's a peacock sitting on the left side of, where's the peacock? Anyway, there's a peacock sitting just inside that rainbow, which shows that you're going through this gate into the imaginative realm.
Hmm.
And then when you cross the rainbow, right at the apex of the rainbow, there's a woman clothed. There's a woman with a child, like a Madonna and child figure. And
Mhm.
under her, you find the alchemical pelican feeding its
Oh.
young from the blood of its breast.
Mm-hmm.
So she's obviously she's the mother and child. There's this image of self-sacrifice. That's why the alchemical pelican is there. So you've now entered inspirational consciousness, from imaginative consciousness gone to inspirational consciousness. And gosh, somewhere there's these birds on either side. You can see there's a sacred ibis on the one extreme of the building, and
Mm-hmm.
on the other side there seems to be what we would call a hardy-dar or some other kind of similar bird. But I'm not sure what those birds mean for the Princess Antonia of Württemberg, but clearly these birds indicate another threshold, probably similar to what the swan would do for certain alchemists.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So
When you
you can see, and then you go up from there still further to the higher sort of trinity of figures right at the top. You're sitting at the apex of that, what do you call it, the pediment of the building. There's a sort of trinity of figures sitting at the top, which indicate understanding and wisdom. And the top one is Keter, the crown, or, the primal foundation of
Mhm.
creation. It's God the Father or God the Mother, that archetype. So you've got that whole Kabbalistic tree with these various emanations built into this temple of imagination. I mean, we could talk for hours about it. I'm not going to. But there's so much symbol. But it's not even that I want to paint like this. That's not the point. I'm not influenced by this picture in as much as I want to paint like this. I don't. But what I love about it is that you've got a single painting that contains the whole of alchemy or the whole of Kabbala in one painting.
Yeah.
And the fact that this amazing woman, Princess Antonia of Württemberg, and her female friends, already in the 1700s, here's a group of women studying esotericism while the men were being slaughtered on the battlefield. And they actually had spiritual teachers, Kabbalistic teachers that they were going to. And they had a circle who studied together. I think that's really interesting.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to share that because it shows how, I mean, I'm very interested in alchemical manuscript paintings. I'm sure you are too.
Yes.
These glass retorts and flasks that you're using.
Yeah.
If you look at Robert Flood, that alchemist Robert Flood, the English alchemist, he's got lots of glass flasks in his work. He'll show the stages of creation, like in the book of Genesis, taking place inside glass flasks, with the understanding that we go through that inner process of Genesis ourselves. So it's very mystical, the whole thing.
Mm.
And so I see that Princess Antonia's painting is very much like the alchemical diagrams, but much more complex because it
Mm.
includes literally hundreds of symbols. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah. And the
yeah.
symbols, what I love about them also is that they're not static. There's a lot of interpretation that people had.
There's this phrase they use with regard to symbols. I mean, linguists talk about multivalency. They say symbols are multivalent, meaning that they have significance on so many levels. So you can understand them literally, you can understand them allegorically, you can understand them on other higher levels too. So nothing is wrong.
Yeah.
You
That's
can
why I
enter them
like
on.
it. I
Mm.
like it because, you said earlier, are you a believer? Or are you a knower or a seer? Or who knows if I really know anything? But I have much more comfort in modalities that have chances to grow or change.
Mm.
So symbols are great because obviously one person's version of it, you have an emotional connection to something
Absolutely.
that sometimes people don't. So it's almost
That's
more like
right.
a language that you're learning by
Absolutely.
expressing it. And then seeing it come back at you kind of like you getting to paint this great
That's
man,
right.
this epic man. And there he was right there. You were making his paintings with him. And then this
Yeah.
idea of making something, thinking about it, feeling into it, and this small secret level in your artwork, and then seeing it out in the world someday in other
Absolutely.
ways.
Yeah.
So I think it's really exciting. Well, thank you so much for sharing it.
Great pleasure. And thank you for hosting me. I appreciate it.
It's so interesting. Yeah, I appreciate you sharing so
Well,
much.
and I wish you the best with your ongoing work.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to today's episode of Art and Alchemy Lab. If you enjoyed what you heard, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode. Your likes, shares, and reviews help this podcast to reach more people, and it means the world to have your support. Until next week, stay curious, everyone.